We can talk forever. We have 15 minutes.
So, it's a great privilege to meet you. Thank you. Not for the purpose of controversy, but I'm going to go with the honorific of Mr. Prime Minister.
Well, keep going. No.
Great. Before us here today, obviously we have cadets at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, U.S. Air Force Academy, Virginia Military Institute, and the Royal Canadian Military College, along with their officers. And it's a rare opportunity to hear from a giant of Israel. And I'd like to begin with a fundamental question, and then want to get to the cadets' questions as well. It strikes me that you're actually, through your own life, something of the personification of the Israel-American relationship. Can you just give them in brief form how your life brought you to this closeness with the United States, working with the United States, and the vital nature of the connection between Israel and the US? And then we'll move on to the next.
You have sleeping bags there? I went to the United States first as a child for about a year, and then to high school, and my father was doing some research in the Philadelphia area. Then went back and served in the Israeli Army in our Special Forces unit for 5 years as a soldier and officer. Then went to study at MIT and came back to Israel and basically joined the political world after a few years and went to serve in diplomatic posts in the United States as the Deputy Chief of Mission in our Washington Embassy. I always admired the United States enormously. I think there's a tremendous identification. Israel is one of the few countries in the world where being pro-American is, one, very broad. Second, it is uncontested. And third, it is never going to change. That's not always the case across the board. And I think it's because there's a deep affinity. The United States, I spoke 3 times at the joint session of Congress. That's a great honor that was accorded to me. And I noticed on the wall opposite of where I was speaking, there was basically a tablet of Moses going to the Promised Land. And America was built around an idea, the new Promised Land, and we are the original Promised Land. So that affinity, I think, is what binds us together in more ways than one. We are in a battle for the future of free civilization. It is contested from many areas. Your job is to help defend it in the vital area of possible military confrontation. And I think that, or to avoid it, you have to be very strong. But this confrontation also is challenged today by one extremely dangerous power, and that is Iran, which is controlled by theological regime that says that America is the great Satan and Israel is the small Satan. And I sometimes talk to my European friends and I say, you're just a middle-sized Satan. But you can be the youngest and smallest, you can be the eldest and biggest, but we're simply on the front line. If Iran, that chants death to America and death to Israel, in that order, if Iran has nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them with orbital systems, that means that every one of your cities in Canada, in America, anywhere else, would be under the threat of basically nuclear blackmail and possibly the use of nuclear weapons. And that is a change, a pivot of history that we cannot arrive. I've devoted much of my time in office to challenge that, to prevent that from happening. And I think this will be the worst security development in the coming years that we must address, not merely for our safety, but for yours as well. So the affinity is deep, it's personal, but it's beyond that. There is an affinity of our common civilization that needs to be protected against those who would destroy our freedoms and our values. And that's why I particularly welcome the opportunity to talk to you, because you are charged with defending just that. Thank you for what you're doing.
So So in 2015, I believe you gave an address to the joint session of Congress, and that's where you gestured to the statue of Moses at the back after your incredible words there. You know, there are a lot of onlookers who say, by doing that, Prime Minister Netanyahu made Israel a partisan issue, which I think is total nonsense and ahistoric. There are others who say he's gambling with the Israel-US relationship. You, beyond anybody, understands and has a mastery of the Israel-US relationship, and yet you felt compelled to speak and press Israel's case by way of a speech that I can tell you my heart was thumping with pride as I watched it. And I was thankful for it sincerely as a Jew from the United Kingdom. And I completely applauded you from afar, literally. Why did you feel compelled to go and speak? Explain to people, that's what I want. Explain why it was necessary and right for you to go and bring your voice, your powers of articulation to oppose the JCPOA, though it was in opposition to a seminal foreign policy platform, plank, for then President Barack Obama.
Well, it's not, you don't do this lightheartedly.
Right.
And it quite considerable reflection before I made that decision, but I did it because I thought that the future of my country was imperiled if I didn't do so. The JCPOA was a highway paved with gold for Iran to become, with international approval, a threshold nuclear state. It basically allows them to reach within a fixed time, regardless of what they do, regardless of terrorism, aggression, ballistic missile development, or even weapons development. It allows them to reach the critical stage, which is in creating atomic weapons, which is the enrichment of uranium for the core of the nuclear bomb. If you want to think of what a nuclear weapon is, it's okay. It's a rifle. Okay, the rifle is the missile. Okay, the bullet in the rifle, the encasing, is the weapon. The powder, gunpowder, is the enriched uranium or plutonium. That is the most difficult component to produce. You can make ballistic missiles, you can make the weapon itself, but the most difficult thing to do is enrich uranium, which requires very careful calibration, industrial sites, and so on. And it's a very complex, complicated thing to do. What the JCPOA does, it doesn't address the rifle, it doesn't address the casing, it addresses the powder, but it says that within a limited time, which right now, by the way, what's left is about 2 years, that's it. In about 2 years, Iran would have an unlimited capacity. That's if you go back to this agreement, okay? Iran would have the capacity to enrich uranium with centrifuges that they've developed now to be about 40 times more effective under the agreement than they had before to enrich uranium. So if this agreement goes through, Iran has immunity, international immunity, to develop the critical core in making an atomic arsenal. It just has mounds of yellow cake, okay, they have that. They just distill it through this distillery called centrifuges, and they make the powder that goes into the weapon. Now that's crazy. It's enough that they don't cover the other things. It's enough they don't cover their aggression, their terror, the delivery systems, the weapon. It doesn't cover any of that. But it actually it does cover the enrichment and gives them the international seal of approval. So Iran, without the nuclear agreement, is a poor country, an isolated country, and a country that has no immunity from the one thing that does stop nuclear weapons development by rogue states, and that's the threat of military action or military action. Or military action. An agreement doesn't stop it. Didn't stop it with North Korea. They had an agreement. Didn't stop it. With Syria, Syria didn't have it. We stopped it militarily. Iraq, they were all signatories to the NPT. We stopped it militarily. Libya Gaddafi had a nuclear weapons program. He didn't, he was afraid that what we did to Saddam, the U.S. would do to him, so he gave it up. But North Korea wasn't afraid of military action, so they had an agreement, both the NPT and nuclear agreements galore. Who cares? They just did it. If you want to stop it, you have to be prepared to act militarily because the best agreement doesn't stop any one of these regimes. With or without agreement, nuclear, or rather military option can stop and deters Iran. Iran, in the last 2 years, is not afraid that there will be a military action, so they're upping their level of enrichment. You have to be prepared to act militarily or you cannot stop it. Once you don't stop it, then you're faced with a regime that has nuclear weapons. I think there's a little conflict not very far north of it that shows you how complicated things become when you have one of the sides, okay, invading another and they have nuclear weapons. It's a different thing altogether. That's not a theological regime, okay? Iran is like 20 North Koreas, okay? More actually, 40 North Koreas in terms of GDP, okay? So that is a very, very dangerous, and with an ideology, death to America. So obviously I felt that having the JCPOA that gives Iran with this agreement, Iran becomes a rich country and a nuclear threshold country and a country that is basically has immunity from the signatories of the pact. I said in Congress, and I say that today too, with or without an agreement, we will do what we have to do to defend Israel. That was the reason why I went to Congress. I didn't think it was only our security and our survival that was at stake, but also America. Now, do you challenge an American president? Well, if you have to. I mean, Ben-Gurion discounted the warnings of the American Secretary of State and declared the state of Israel. Prime Minister Eshkol, on the eve of the Six-Day War, and the U.S. told him, don't act. He acted because he had to. Otherwise, we would have been destroyed. And that was my own concern as well. It wasn't a partisan issue. By the way, I checked, just so you know. I meet every congressional visitor here, okay? Just, you'd say, well, not in wartime. No, in wartime too. Check that too. So I checked for, the last few years, and I checked. And I didn't plan this, but there were 300 visitors that I met, okay? 150 Republicans, 150 Democrats, okay? So this is hogwash. In fact, turning it into a partisan issue was not my doing, but the sayings that basically it's a joke and false.
I completely agree.
And false. I stand for Israel, and I stand there not as when I stood in Congress or anytime anywhere else. I've challenged Republican presidents, I can tell you that. When the second Bush administration told us to get out of the operation that we were doing against terrorist strongholds and suicide bomber nests in Jenin and Shem here, I went to the Congress and spoke there with 50 senators. So I didn't do that as a Republican or as a Democrat. I did it as an Israeli patriot. I so happen to believe that a strong Israel means a strong America. And I think that's good for America as well. That's the long answer to a short question. Yeah.
I'd like to, if I may, just hit two other points, but before I do, there's one thing I want you to say. Is that you're the son of a storied Israeli historian. There was another dimension there, which was that you had a voice that you could bring when, in centuries past, the Jewish people had no voice when looking down the barrel of their own destruction. How did that compel you?
Well, I think this is the story of the country you're seeing today. I mean, the Jewish people lived here from around 3500 BC to about 700. That's about 700, the 7th century, which is the Muslim invasion. We lived here and were pummeled by the Romans, but continued to live here. Wrote the great works of the Talmud and the Mishnah here. People don't know that. After the destruction of the Second Temple, which is familiar to many of you because that's where Jesus turned the tables on the money changers. Okay, so we were here for about 2,000 years, and then we lost our land. And when we lost our land, we were basically dispersed to the far corners of the earth, and we were slaughtered in a rising cycle of slaughters that culminated finally in the 20th century in the Holocaust. We were totally defenseless. When I explained this, I was in China in my first term in office. I'd been in office 5 terms, no term limits, you know. So in my first term, and it was 1996, I visited China, and it was led then by a different leader. His name was Benjamin. He was very jovial. He was very impressed with Israel because of our agriculture and techniques and so on, which were nothing compared to what we have today, but made a big difference in China. So he said, you know, the Jewish people are great people. And I said, yep. You know, I said, you know, and he said, you're an ancient people. And I said, and so are the Chinese. I said, yep. I said, you know, there's one difference. He said, what's the difference? He said, well, how many Chinese are at the time? 1 billion, whatever, fewer. He said, well, and how many Jews are there? I said, in the world, at the time, about 12 million. And you saw all the jaws drop there in that office. I said, only 12? I said, yeah. And I said, that's a small number if we've been around for thousands of years. Because the Jews and the Chinese and the Indians, more or less, are the oldest civilizations on earth. Well, he said, what happened? I mean, we should have been around 200 million today. And I said, a lot of things happened, but essentially they boil down to one thing. We lost our land. And when we lost our land, the Chinese kept the land, the Indians kept the land. We didn't have a land. Dispersed, we were basically massacred. And that's what being a Jew meant for thousands of years. In our exile, you were massacred. America is an exception. But periodically, we suffered massacres, pogroms, expulsions, and so on. So the recovery of our sovereignty and our return to our homeland was accompanied also by the essential component of recovering our capacity for self-defense. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. We wouldn't survive here in a minute. And recovering our capacity for self-defense meant that we had to build, obviously the first thing you need is, what do you need to survive? Class?
Roof over your head.
No, not a roof over your head. We need you guys. We need an army, right? We need weapons. We need, you know, in today's terms, F-35, drones, submarines, intel, you know. And there's one quality about it, and we developed that very nicely. But, you know, as the decades pass, these weapon systems have, and intel systems have one unfortunate quality. You know what that is? They cost a lot of money. So we had to build not only a military capacity that we had early on, but we had to create an economic capacity. And for that, I led really a free market revolution here, both as prime minister, but also and especially as finance minister in the early 2000s, okay? And we changed Israel. We turned it into a market economy. I believe in free markets, but I believe them also for a collectivist reason, not only for individual rights, but for a collectivist reason, because that's the only way we can create the wealth that is necessary to support a strong military intelligence. We've passed in GDP per capita Japan and Britain and France and Canada. No offense. And 2 weeks ago, I was informed that we passed Germany. And that's because we married our technological capacity that has a perpetual motion engine in our military, especially in military intelligence. But, you know, you come out of military intelligence, like my brother-in-law was a brilliant pilot and became a brilliant technologist. And he was working here, you know, 40 years ago. He came out 45 years ago. He worked for one of the companies, couldn't stand the bureaucracy, the taxes, and so on. I went to work for a small company called Intel. You know, his son came back here and just did these unbelievable exits here. So we married the technological capacity that you have. Technological capacity by itself does not produce wealth. Science and education by itself does not produce wealth. Otherwise, the Soviet Union would have been a very wealthy country. It had the greatest mathematicians, physicists, metallurgists, you name it, all right? But they were dirt poor, and they still are. We married that capacity to free markets and created the other component. That is, you know its importance, you know how important that is. And we're an intelligence power. We are in my judgment, America's greatest ally in intelligence. You know the five eyes?
Mm-hmm.
You know the sixth eye? This is the sixth eye. It's called Israel. And it provides a lot of intelligence to the United States. We receive invaluable American military assistance, which we've done with successive presidents, including, by the way, in a 10-year agreement that I had signed with President Obama after the speech in Congress. Mm-hmm. And that reflects, first of all, the support of the American people for Israel, understanding that basically we're a frontline bastion for free civilization, but also it reflects the fact that Israel is, and we're enormously grateful for it, but also it reflects the fact that Israel is giving the United States very valuable military intelligence. How much bigger is America compared to Israel in population? Not in territory, population. It's about 40 times bigger, about 40 times. And what is the biggest collection agency in the world, in the Western world?
The IRS.
It's the NSA, not the IRS. The IRS is bigger than anything, but it's the NSA. Well, I can assure you that the NSA is not 40 times bigger than our collection agency, our military intelligence collection agency. The NSA is not even 10 times bigger. So Israel is maybe a tiny body, but it has a huge head. And you know the value of military intelligence and military technology, and it's becoming more and more and more and more important. So the alliance between Israel and the United States is an alliance of values, but it's also an alliance of a military and intelligence alliance of tremendous value for both of us. So you ask, what is the big difference? The big difference that happened here in the Jewish state is that the Jewish people, after centuries of being defenseless, discovered the capacity to defend themselves. The attacks on the Jewish people, anti-Semitism and so on, is not as old as time. It's about 2,500 years old. So those who wish to destroy us keep propping up. Today it's Iran, and sometimes they change. But what has changed is not that we are being attacked. What has changed is that we can defend ourselves with a growing capacity and with an important alliance. The most important alliance that we have is with the United States. That's the indispensable alliance. So that's what's changed. I'll take one more question. If any of you want to ask a question.
Anyone by show of hands? You can choose, sir. If you like.
Yeah, anyone. You choose.
Okay.
I don't want to get into this.
Okay, we'll go to the gentleman at the end. Ryan.
Sir, thank you for coming. Cadet Myers with West Point. We've been focusing a lot talking about Iran, but I wanted to kind of change it a little bit. And I was curious, where do you think Israel will be focusing on China, considering the strong alliance that Israel and America have? Do you think that they're going to start shifting focus more, a little bit more towards China's One Belt, One Road initiative as they try to become a power, not only in the Middle East, but also in Africa?
I think China is already a world power. It's very clear. And the reason it got to be a world power is because they did at least part of the rerouting of their economy to greater degrees of freedom. That's what Deng Xiaoping did. And it had enormous historical consequences. The entry of China into the World Trade Organization complemented that and made China a very powerful economic engine. They also are less concerned with patents, if you haven't noticed. And not only that. So obviously China is a formidable power. And it is not militarily here, but it is obviously this capacity. Soon there'll be whatever. Their military spending is about, I think, 300 billion, something like that, right? Something like that. 350 already. It's almost half of the United States. Their GDP is reaching up. And I think it's, obviously it's something that we have to contend with. I was happy to have Chinese investments here, but I said you cannot have them in one field. In the technological military or technological intelligence field, obviously, we don't do it. And I said this openly to Xi and the Chinese chief of staff who came to visit me. I said, well, happy to have civilian cooperation and investments, but within limits. We've created an entity that checks now, I shall say, foreign investments in Israel to make sure, without, I think, overburdening our robust economy with bureaucracy, but we want to have a mechanism to screen that. In a larger sense, I think that our great misfortune was that in the first half of the 20th century, the United States was not the leading power in the world, and we paid a horrendous price with the loss of a third of our people in the Holocaust. And I think the world paid an enormous price in the worst war in history. In the second half of the 20th century, we were lucky to have the United States assume the role of being the leading power on earth. It coincided with the rise of Israel and our growing alliance over time, which was not accidentally connected also to our performance in the Six-Day War and after that. But I think that the jury is out on the first half of the 21st century. And at least from my point of view, it's an imperative for our free civilization to continue to thrive and survive, that the United States maintain its role as the world's leading power. There. I answered your question as diplomatically as I could.
Mr. Prime Minister, so I know that we have to go, but the cadets would like to present you with the gift of thanks and would like to get a photo. And before they do, just before they do, I would like to acknowledge co-founder Rosita Pini for bringing you to our group today. It's down to her hard work, and I thank you for your time and all that you've done, sir. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I want you to know that my brother, who died leading the Entebbe rescue, had gone after he was first wounded in the Six-Day War. He was wounded in the last battle on the Golan Heights, and then went to study at Harvard. Came back after a year. He made the dean's list, but he said, I have to be here in Israel, and he came in, and he said, I have to be in Israel because even though I'm an invalid, his elbow was smashed, I have to be among my friends who are doing reserve duty and fighting terrorists and so on. And it was around that time that I joined the Army, and I was asked to go to officer school in our special unit, and I declined. I said, no, I'm going to university. I was accepted to Yale University at the time. They accepted me 3 years ahead of time, which nobody else would do, and I said, I'm not signing up for 2 years of officer school. And the commander of my unit said to me, you go back to, I'm giving you a weekend pass. You come back on Sunday, and you go to officer school, or I'm going to throw you out of the unit, which was a fate worse than death. So I didn't know what to do. I went and talked to my older brother, He's now an invalid. He's a student studying mathematics in Hebrew University. And I said, well, what should I do? And he said, oh, it's no problem. Tell him I'll go in your stead. I said, well, you're an invalid. And you're old. He was 23. You're old. You're married. You can't do that. He said, just tell him to look at my file. Pulled his file. And he was the outstanding cadet in our version of West Point. And he said, okay, bring him over. And now they had a problem how to get through the medical committee, They planned that as a military operation. And they got him through. And then I went to officer school. And so the two of us were soldiers in the same unit. The reason I'm telling you that is because in the time that my brother was in the United States in his Harvard year, he was operated in a hospital called Walter Reed. Mm-hmm. So I remember he spoke about the way he was treated. And he spoke about it with glowing eyes. So I'm taking this opportunity to thank you for that too. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Canadian College. We'd like to present, each of us would like to present you with a token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
And then you have...
Don't I get it?
No, you do.
Case 9000.
Sir, on behalf of West Point, these are our West Point cup plates. Thank you.
What are you serving?
Where am I serving at? Hope to be infantry, sir.
What is that?
Infantry. Infantry, then branch.
Man like, that's up. Could never do this.
And then you have them here, sir.
So on behalf of Royal Military College in Canada and Saint Jean, I'd like to give you this mug for your company in the morning.
And what do you serve in?
I serve in officer, Air Combat System Officer.
Okay. Oh, that's the guys who want to get rid of the pilots, you know?
Actually,
Sir,
And you?
on behalf of VMI, here's a flashlight,
Oh.
and we hope that it lights the darkness and shows you the way to
Thank
peace
you.
and truth, sir.
And what do you serve in?
I hope to become a foreign affairs officer in the Navy.
Oh, that's. Thank you very much. Thank you.